Hello there, weary traveler, and welcome to this cozy corner of history. Before we begin our journey back to medieval Europe's harshest winters, I wanted to extend a warm greeting to you, dear listener. Whether you're nestled under the covers ready to drift off to sleep or simply looking to unwind with some quiet historical storytelling, I'm so glad you've chosen to join me tonight. If you don't mind, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you right now. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. If you enjoy this style of calm, immersive tales from the past, go ahead and click that subscribe button. But for now, let's allow the stresses of the modern world to melt away as we travel back to 14th century Europe. In the autumn of 1347, in a small village nestled between rolling hills of what we now call northern France, a peasant woman named Margot felt the first bite of winter in the evening air. At 28 years old, she had survived enough harsh seasons to recognize the signs. The leaves had turned earlier than usual, and the geese were flying south in unusually large formations. Her weathered hands, already rough from years of fieldwork, traced the wooden walls of her modest home as she mentally catalogued what lay ahead. Margot's cottage was typical of peasant dwellings in this era. Built with timber frames and filled with wattle and daub, the walls were thick but far from airtight. Small gaps between the wooden planks would soon become pathways for winter's cruel fingers. The single room served as kitchen, bedroom, and workshop all at once. A central hearth dominated the space, its smoke rising through a simple hole in the thatched roof. This would be her family's lifeline through the coming months. Her husband, Guillaume, 31 years old and bent slightly from years of plowing, returned from the fields carrying news that made Margot's stomach tighten with worry. The harvest had been meager this year. The wheat yield was perhaps half of what they had hoped for, and the barley fared little better. Their 3 children, ranging in age from 4 to 12, would need every scrap of food they could preserve through the long, dark months ahead. Medieval peasants understood winter as we cannot today. It was not merely cold weather to endure, but a season that could easily mean death for the unprepared. Food stores had to last from October until March or April, depending on when spring finally broke winter's grip. There would be no fresh vegetables, no milk from cows too thin to produce, and hunting was largely the privilege of nobles. Everything depended on what they could preserve, store, and ration through nearly half the year. As Margot lit her oil lamp that evening, the small flame casting dancing shadows on the walls, she began the mental calculations that would occupy her thoughts for weeks. How much grain could they spare for bread? Which vegetables would keep longest in their root cellar? How many of their precious few chickens could they afford to slaughter for winter protein? Each decision would ripple through the months ahead, potentially meaning the difference between survival and starvation. The village around them was making similar preparations. Smoke began rising from more chimneys as families started the process of preserving meat and vegetables. The sound of axes echoed through the woods as men gathered what might be their last loads of fresh firewood before the deep snows came. Children helped their parents stuff rags and moss into cracks in walls, creating barriers against the wind that would soon howl through their settlement like a living thing, seeking warmth to devour. But Margot had learned something crucial from her mother, who had survived the terrible winter of 1315 when crops failed across Europe. The secret to surviving winter was not just about having enough food and fuel, though those were certainly essential. It was about understanding that winter changed everything about how people lived, worked, and even thought. The rhythms of life would slow to match the shortened days, and every action would need to be measured against the precious resources they had hoarded. As she banked the fire for the night, covering the coals with ash to preserve them until morning, Margot wondered if this winter would test them more severely than others. The signs in nature suggested it might, and the poor harvest certainly didn't help their prospects. But there were techniques, passed down through generations of peasants who had faced similar challenges, that might see them through. Tomorrow she would begin implementing the first of these ancient survival strategies. The wind picked up outside, rattling the wooden shutters and reminding her that winter's approach was relentless and unforgiving. 3 weeks later, as November's chill settled deeper into the valley, Margot stood in her small kitchen surrounded by the organized chaos of preservation. The wooden table, worn smooth by years of use, was covered with vegetables in various stages of preparation. Turnips lay sorted by size, onions hung in carefully braided strings from the ceiling beams, and a large wooden barrel sat ready to receive the season's sauerkraut. The process of making sauerkraut was one that Margot had learned at her grandmother's side when she was barely tall enough to reach the work surface. She selected each cabbage head carefully, removing the outer leaves and cutting away any spots that might harbor rot. The cabbage was then shredded with a long, sharp knife, a task that required both skill and patience. Too thick and it wouldn't ferment properly. Too thin, and it would turn to mush before spring arrived. Layer by layer, Margot packed the shredded cabbage into the barrel, sprinkling coarse salt between each layer. The salt would draw moisture from the cabbage, creating the brine necessary for fermentation. Her hands worked rhythmically, pressing down each layer firmly before adding the next. This ancient process would transform fresh vegetables into preserved food that could last through the coldest months, providing essential nutrients when fresh greens were nothing but a memory. Guillaume worked nearby, preparing their winter meat supply. 2 pigs had been slaughtered at the first hard frost, a timing that was crucial for preservation. The cold weather would keep the meat from spoiling while they processed it. But it couldn't be so cold that the work became impossible. Every part of the animal would be used. Nothing could be wasted in a world where waste meant potential starvation. The process of preserving pork was both art and science. Some cuts were rubbed with salt and hung in the rafters to cure slowly in the cold, dry air. Others were packed in barrels with alternating layers of salt, creating a brine that would keep the meat edible for months. The fat was rendered into lard, which would serve not only as a cooking medium but also as a way to preserve other foods by sealing them away from air and bacteria. Their eldest daughter, Marie, at 12 years old, had begun learning these crucial skills. She watched intently as her mother demonstrated how to test the saltiness of the brine by floating an egg in it. If the egg floated properly, the salt concentration was correct for preservation. If it sank, more salt was needed. These were the kinds of practical knowledge that meant survival, passed down through generations of women who had faced similar challenges. The family's small root cellar, dug into the hillside behind their cottage, was gradually filling with their winter stores. Apples lay carefully arranged so they wouldn't touch each other, preventing rot from spreading. Carrots and parsnips were buried in sand to keep them crisp. Dried beans filled pottery jars, while strings of onions and garlic hung from wooden pegs driven into the earthen walls. But preservation wasn't just about food. Margot also spent these autumn weeks preparing materials they would need for warmth and light. Candles were made from mutton fat, a laborious process that involved repeatedly dipping wicks into hot tallow until they built up sufficient thickness. These candles would provide precious light during the long winter nights when darkness fell by late afternoon. Rushes gathered from the nearby stream were dried and soaked in fat to create rushlights, a cheaper alternative to candles. Though they burned quickly and had to be replaced frequently, they provided enough light for essential evening tasks like mending clothes or preparing food. Every source of light was precious when winter nights stretched for 16 hours or more. The preservation process also extended to maintaining their tools and equipment. Guillaume spent evening hours repairing wooden handles, sharpening metal tools, and waterproofing leather goods with animal fat. A broken shovel or damaged harness in the middle of winter could spell disaster, so everything had to be in perfect working order before the deep cold arrived. As the last light of day faded from the western sky, Margot felt a growing sense of satisfaction. Their stores were taking shape and the preservation work was progressing well. But she knew that having enough preserved food was only the first challenge in surviving a medieval winter. December arrived with an unusual ferocity that year, bringing with it snow that fell steadily for 3 days without pause. By the time the storm cleared, drifts reached nearly to the eaves of the cottage and the familiar landscape had transformed into something alien and hostile. Inside their small home, Margot's family had begun implementing the subtle but crucial architectural modifications that would help them survive the months ahead. The single room that served as their entire living space was now arranged very differently than it had been in summer. The family's sleeping area had been moved closer to the central hearth, with straw mattresses arranged in a careful pattern that maximized shared body heat while allowing everyone access to the fire's warmth. The children slept between their parents, an arrangement that provided additional warmth for the most vulnerable family members. Heavy wool curtains, woven during the previous winter's long evenings, were hung around the sleeping area to create a smaller space that could be more easily heated. These curtains, made from the coarsest wool that would have been too rough for clothing, served as an additional barrier against the cold air that crept through gaps in the walls. The concept was similar to the bed curtains used by wealthy nobles, but adapted for peasant resources and needs. The hearth itself had been modified for winter efficiency. Guillaume had spent considerable time in late autumn gathering clay from the riverbank and mixing it with straw to create a more effective chimney structure. The improved design drew smoke more efficiently while radiating more heat into the room. Flat stones arranged around the hearth absorbed heat during the day and continued radiating warmth well into the night. One of the most ingenious adaptations was the use of heated stones as portable warmth sources. Each evening, Margot would place several smooth river stones in the coals of the fire. Once thoroughly heated, these stones were wrapped in cloth and used to warm beds before the family retired for the night. The stones would retain heat for hours, providing comfortable warmth without the risk of fire from hot coals. The cottage's windows, which in summer had been left open for ventilation, were now sealed with oiled cloth that admitted some light while blocking wind and snow. These window coverings were carefully maintained, as any tiers would need immediate repair to prevent heat loss. The oiled cloth was made by rubbing animal fat into linen until it became translucent and somewhat waterproof. Animal heat played a crucial role in medieval winter survival strategies. The family's remaining livestock, 2 goats and several chickens, were brought into a small lean-to attached to the main cottage. The animals' body heat helped warm the building, while their presence also made it easier to care for them during severe weather. This arrangement was so common that many peasant homes were specifically designed with integrated animal spaces. The floor, which had been covered with fresh rushes in summer, now supported a thick layer of straw that provided insulation from the cold earth below. This floor covering was changed less frequently in winter, as the decomposing organic matter actually generated a small amount of heat through bacterial action. The concept might seem unsanitary by modern standards, but it was an effective adaptation to harsh conditions. Margot had also implemented what she called heat conservation cooking. Instead of maintaining a cooking fire throughout the day, she prepared most meals during a concentrated period when the fire was hottest, using the residual heat to warm stones and heat water that would be stored in covered pots for later use. This approach maximized the caloric value extracted from their precious fuel supply while maintaining warmth in the cottage. The family's clothing had also adapted to their indoor environment. They wore multiple layers of wool garments with outer layers that could be added or removed as the fire burned higher or lower. Woolen caps were worn even indoors, as significant body heat was lost through the head. Feet were kept warm with thick woolen stockings and leather shoes stuffed with straw for additional insulation. By mid-December, these modifications had transformed their cottage into a carefully engineered survival shelter. Every aspect of their living space had been optimized for heat retention and efficient use of fuel. But Margot knew that even the best shelter was only as good as the fuel available to heat it, and their wood supply was already beginning to concern her. Outside, the wind howled through the bare trees, reminding the family that winter had only just begun. The blizzard that began on December 18th lasted for 6 days, and when it finally ended, Margot faced a reality that made her stomach clench with fear. Their carefully stacked woodpile, which had seemed adequate in autumn, was already diminished by more than she had anticipated. The unusually severe weather had forced them to burn fuel at a rate that threatened to exhaust their supply before winter's end. Guillaume struggled through snow that reached his thighs to reach the woodshed, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. At 31, he was still strong, but even he found the work of splitting frozen wood exhausting. Each swing of the axe sent shockwaves through his arms, and the wood seemed to resist every blow. Some pieces were so frozen that they shattered rather than split cleanly, creating unusable fragments that burned too quickly to provide sustained heat. The fuel shortage crisis was forcing the family to make difficult decisions about heat conservation. They could no longer afford to keep a fire burning continuously. Instead, They implemented a careful schedule where the fire was allowed to burn high twice per day, once in the morning for cooking and warmth and once in the evening before bed. During the long hours between these periods, they relied on heated stones, heavy clothing, and shared body heat to stay warm. Margot had learned from her mother about alternative fuel sources that could extend their wood supply. Dried animal dung, when mixed with straw and formed into bricks, burned slowly and produced steady heat. The process of making these fuel bricks had to be done before the waste froze solid, requiring careful timing and unpleasant work. But the alternative was potentially freezing to death, so the family worked together to create a supply of these emergency fuel sources. Apple wood from pruned orchard trees burned differently than oak or beech. It produced less heat per log but burned more slowly, making it ideal for overnight fires when the goal was maintaining minimal warmth rather than generating high heat for cooking. Margot carefully rationed their apple wood, reserving it specifically for the coldest nights when the temperature dropped so low that even their well-insulated cottage became dangerously cold. The village faced a collective fuel crisis that winter. Families began sharing resources in ways that would have been unthinkable during more prosperous times. Guillaume joined a group of men who took turns breaking trail through the snow to reach dead trees in the forest. This cooperative effort allowed them to access fuel sources that would have been impossible for individuals to reach, but it also meant sharing the wood they gathered according to the amount of work each man contributed. Marie, their 12-year-old daughter, proved surprisingly resourceful in finding alternative fuel sources. She discovered that the dried stems of certain weeds, when bundled tightly together, could be used as kindling that burned hot enough to ignite damp wood. Her knowledge of which plants made the best emergency fuel became invaluable as the family's resources dwindled. The process of rationing fuel required constant attention and planning. Margot developed a system where she marked their remaining wood supply with notches, calculating how many logs they could burn each day if they were to last until spring. The mathematics of survival were brutal and unforgiving. Too generous with fuel now, and they might face weeks without heat in February or March. Too conservative, and they risked illness or death from immediate cold exposure. Indoor air quality became a significant concern as the family burned alternative fuels and kept their cottage sealed against the cold. The combination of animal dung fuel, reduced ventilation, and constant occupation by humans and animals created air that was thick and often difficult to breathe. But opening windows or doors to improve air circulation meant losing precious heat, creating a dangerous balance between air quality and warmth. As January approached, Margot realized they would need to implement even more extreme conservation measures. She began planning for the possibility that they might need to abandon part of their cottage, sealing off sections that were too difficult to heat and concentrating their lives into an even smaller space. This strategy had been used by her grandmother during the terrible winter of 1315, and it might become necessary again. The fuel crisis was testing not just their physical resources, but their psychological resilience as well. The constant cold, the careful rationing of every piece of wood, and the knowledge that their situation could worsen created a stress that affected every member of the family. But Margot had learned that survival often depended as much on maintaining hope and discipline as it did on having adequate supplies. As she banked the evening fire with special care, covering the coals with ash to preserve every bit of heat until morning, Margot wondered how many other families in their village were facing similar calculations. February arrived with what the villagers called the hunger moon, a time when preserved food stores ran low and the promise of spring seemed impossibly distant. In Margot's cottage, the carefully rationed supplies that had seemed adequate in autumn were now stretched thin, requiring increasingly creative approaches to nutrition and meal planning. The family had lost weight over the winter months, a common and expected part of surviving the season. But Margot watched her children carefully for signs that hunger was becoming dangerous. Their grain supplies, the foundation of medieval peasant nutrition, were running particularly low. The barley that had been ground into flour in autumn was now measured out in careful portions each morning. Margot had learned to make bread with increasing amounts of other ingredients: bran, dried peas ground into flour, and even sawdust from certain trees that could provide bulk without harmful effects. These substitutes made the bread dense and less palatable, but they extended the precious wheat and barley flour through additional weeks. The preserved vegetables in their root cellar showed the effects of months in storage. Many of the apples had developed soft spots that had to be cut away before eating. Some of the root vegetables had begun to sprout, using their stored energy and reducing their nutritional value. Margot had become expert at salvaging what remained edible from vegetables that were beginning to deteriorate, a skill that could mean the difference between adequate nutrition and dangerous deficiency. Their youngest child, Thomas, at 4 years old, was showing signs of the winter weakness that worried Margot most. He had less energy for play, and his usually round cheeks had become hollow. Medieval mothers understood that children were most vulnerable during the late winter months, when food supplies were lowest and the cold had weakened everyone's resistance to illness. She began giving Thomas slightly larger portions, taking them from her own meals to ensure he maintained enough strength to survive until spring. The preservation work they had done in autumn was proving its worth, but it was also revealing its limitations. The sauerkraut Margot had prepared was still edible and provided essential vitamins, but the family was growing tired of its strong taste and soggy texture. The preserved pork was still good, but they had been eating it sparingly to make it last, resulting in meals that were often too light to satisfy their hunger. Margot had learned from her mother about forage foods that could supplement their stores even in winter. Certain tree barks, when properly prepared, could be ground into flour that added bulk to bread. The inner bark of birch trees was particularly valuable, providing both nutrition and a slightly sweet flavor that made other foods more palatable. Gathering and preparing these emergency foods required knowledge, effort, and careful processing to avoid plants that might be harmful. The village had developed informal systems for sharing food during the hunger moon. Families with slightly better stores might trade preserved vegetables for labor, allowing those with less food to earn additional rations through work. Guillaume had been splitting wood for a neighbor in exchange for dried peas, a trade that benefited both families while maintaining the dignity of those who were struggling with food shortages. Marie, their 12-year-old daughter, had taken on increasing responsibility for meal preparation as her mother focused on rationing and food procurement. She had learned to make thin soups from bones that had already been used multiple times, extracting every bit of nutrition and flavor from their limited ingredients. Her skill at making small amounts of food seem more substantial was becoming crucial to the family's morale as well as their nutrition. The psychological effects of the hunger moon were as challenging as the physical ones. The constant attention to food, the careful measurement of every portion, and the gnawing sensation of never quite being full created a mental stress that affected everyone's mood and behavior. The children were more irritable. Guillaume was more prone to silence and brooding, and Margot found herself constantly calculating and recalculating their remaining supplies. But there were also signs that their survival strategies were working. Despite their weight loss and constant hunger, the family remained relatively healthy. No one had developed the swollen joints or bleeding gums that indicated serious nutritional deficiency. Their careful preservation work and rationing had managed to provide minimum adequate nutrition even during the most difficult part of winter. As February progressed, Margot began watching for the subtle signs that spring might eventually arrive. The days were slowly growing longer, though the difference was barely perceptible. On sunny days, icicles would occasionally drip from the cottage eaves, suggesting that temperatures were beginning their gradual climb toward more tolerable levels. But she also knew that March could be the most dangerous month of all, when food supplies reached their lowest point just as winter made its final, often brutal assault. March arrived with a late blizzard that buried the village under 3 feet of new snow, just when the family had begun to hope that winter's grip might be loosening. This storm pushed Margot's family closer to the breaking point than they had come at any time during the long, cold months. Their firewood supply was now critically low, measured not in cords or even individual logs, but in the number of days they could continue heating their cottage. Guillaume had developed a persistent cough that worried Margot deeply. At 31, he had always been the family's source of physical strength, but months of inadequate nutrition and constant cold had weakened his resistance to illness. The cough was dry and harsh, suggesting that his lungs were being irritated by the poor air quality in their sealed cottage as much as by any infection. She knew that if Guillaume became seriously ill, their chances of surviving until spring would be severely compromised. The food situation had become truly desperate. Their grain stores were now measured in handfuls rather than bowls, and Margot had begun extending their bread with increasing amounts of tree bark flour and other substitutes that provided bulk but little real nutrition. The children's portions had been reduced to the absolute minimum she believed they could survive on. And even then, she wasn't certain those portions would last until fresh food became available. Thomas, their youngest at 4 years old, had developed the listless behavior that Margot recognized as a sign of serious undernourishment. He no longer played with his simple wooden toys, instead spending most of his time lying quietly near the fire. His eyes had developed the hollow look that she had seen in children during the worst famines. She began giving him even more of her own food, reducing her own portions to dangerous levels in an attempt to keep her youngest child alive. The village around them was experiencing similar crises. Smoke rose from fewer chimneys each day, indicating that other families were also struggling with fuel shortages. The paths between cottages, which had been maintained through most of the winter, were now often impassable due to lack of energy to clear the snow. The community was fragmenting as each family focused entirely on their own survival. Marie, at 12 years old, had matured remarkably during these difficult months. She now took responsibility for maintaining their fire during the night, waking periodically to add fuel and ensure that the coals didn't die completely. This task, which had previously been handled by adults, was now essential to their survival and too important to entrust to someone who might sleep too deeply. Her ability to manage this responsibility freed Margot to focus on other crucial survival tasks. The family had implemented their most extreme conservation measures yet. They now heated only a portion of their single room, hanging blankets to create an even smaller living space around the hearth. This space was barely large enough for the family to lie down together, but it could be kept warmer with their dwindling fuel supply. They spent most of each day huddled in this tiny area, emerging only for essential tasks like caring for their animals or retrieving supplies. Their livestock situation had also become critical. One of their goats had died during the recent blizzard, succumbing to the combination of cold and inadequate food. The loss of this animal meant not only the end of the small amount of milk it had been producing, but also the loss of its body heat contribution to warming their shelter. Guillaume had butchered the dead goat immediately, providing the family with fresh meat for the first time in weeks, but also highlighting how precarious their situation had become. The psychological strain of their situation was becoming as dangerous as the physical hardships. Margot found herself making increasingly desperate calculations about their survival chances. Should they slaughter their remaining goat for immediate food or try to keep it alive as a source of milk and heat? Should they burn their furniture for fuel or try to make their remaining wood last a few more days? Each decision carried potentially fatal consequences, and the stress of making these choices was exhausting. But even in this desperate situation, Margot had noticed subtle changes that suggested winter might finally be losing its grip. The quality of light during the day had changed, becoming brighter and lasting noticeably longer. On days when the wind wasn't blowing, she could sometimes hear the sound of dripping water, indicating that daytime temperatures were occasionally rising above freezing. These small signs gave her hope that their ordeal might be nearing its end. The village's church bell, which had been silent for weeks due to the cold that made the metal too brittle to ring safely, had begun tolling again during the warmest part of recent days. This sound, barely audible through their sealed cottage, represented more than just the announcement of prayer times. It was a symbol that the community was still alive, still functioning, and still maintaining hope that spring would eventually arrive. As Margot looked at her sleeping family, all of them thinner and weaker than they had been in autumn, she wondered if they had the strength to survive what might be winter's final assault. The fourth week of March brought news that shook the entire village to its core. Old Henrik, the blacksmith who had survived 43 winters in these hills, had been found dead in his cottage by neighbors who noticed that no smoke had risen from his chimney for 2 days. At 67 years old, Henrik had seemed indestructible, a man whose forge had provided essential services to the community for decades. His death sent a wave of fear through the remaining families, as everyone understood that if Henrik couldn't survive this winter, Perhaps none of them could. Margot learned of Henrik's death when Guillaume returned from helping to prepare the body for burial. The task had required 4 men working together, as the ground was too frozen for individual graves, and Henrik's body had to be stored in the church until spring thaw would allow proper interment. Guillaume's face was grim as he described the scene in Henrik's cottage, the cold hearth filled with ashes, the empty food containers, and the evidence that the old blacksmith had burned his wooden tools in a desperate attempt to stay warm during his final days. The village's unofficial leader, Father Benedict, called for a gathering in the church that evening despite the bitter cold. At 45 years old, the priest had ministered to this community for nearly 2 decades, and his steady presence had helped maintain morale through the worst of the winter. But even his usual composure seemed shaken as he addressed the 24 villagers who had enough strength to attend the meeting. His message was stark and honest. The community needed to pool its remaining resources if anyone hoped to survive until spring. The sharing arrangement that emerged from this meeting was both practical and desperate. Families with remaining food stores would share with those who had exhausted their supplies, while those with fuel would provide warmth to those whose firewood was gone. In exchange, the stronger members of starving families would provide labor to help maintain the shared resources. It was a system born of absolute necessity, where individual survival had become impossible and community survival offered the only hope. Margot's family found themselves in a relatively better position than some others, though their situation was still precarious. Their careful rationing and preservation work had left them with enough food for perhaps 2 more weeks, and their fuel supply, while critically low, might last slightly longer with careful management. But Guillaume's persistent cough was worsening, and Thomas's listless behavior suggested that their youngest child was approaching the limit of what his small body could endure. The shared warming arrangement meant that during the coldest part of each day, families would gather in the cottage with the best fuel supply, combining their body heat and sharing the warmth of a single larger fire. This system was efficient from a survival standpoint, but it also meant living in extremely close quarters with people who were all under severe stress. Tempers were short, privacy was non-existent, and the constant presence of others made it difficult for anyone to rest properly. Marie had become essential to the community's survival efforts despite her young age of 12 years. Her energy and relatively small body allowed her to perform tasks that were becoming difficult for weakened adults. She could navigate through deep snow to carry messages between cottages, tend fires during the night shift, and help prepare the meager communal meals. Her cheerful demeanor, maintained despite the hardships, provided emotional support that was as valuable as her physical contributions. The community's food sharing revealed the true extent of their collective desperation. When all remaining stores were combined and inventoried, Father Benedict's calculations showed that with careful rationing, they might have enough food to sustain the group for 10 more days. After that, they would be entirely dependent on whatever wild foods they could forage and whatever help might arrive from outside the village. The mathematics of survival had become brutally simple and terrifyingly finite. But the shared resources also revealed hidden strengths within the community. Widow Catherine, whose husband had died the previous summer, had managed to preserve a remarkable quantity of dried herbs and medicinal plants. These resources, which had seemed less important than food or fuel, now proved invaluable for treating the various illnesses that were beginning to afflict the weakened villagers. Her knowledge of herbal medicine became crucial as more people developed coughs, fevers, and other symptoms of bodies pushed beyond their limits. Young Peter, the miller's son at 16 years old, had discovered a talent for making the most of minimal food supplies. He could prepare communal meals that seemed more substantial than their ingredients should have allowed. Using techniques his grandmother had taught him for stretching food during difficult times, his ability to create satisfying meals from almost nothing became essential to maintaining the group's morale and physical strength. The community arrangement also created new challenges that tested everyone's patience and character. Personal belongings had to be shared, sleeping arrangements were crowded and uncomfortable, and the constant presence of others made it impossible to process grief, fear, or despair in private. Arguments broke out over resource allocation, work assignments, and living arrangements, creating additional stress in an already desperate situation. As March drew toward its end, the community faced a grim reality. Their shared resources had bought them time, but not nearly enough to ensure survival until spring. The weather showed no signs of moderating. Their food supplies continued to dwindle at an alarming rate, and several villagers were showing signs of serious illness that could prove fatal without proper nutrition and warmth. The question was no longer whether they would face starvation, but whether they could maintain their cooperative efforts long enough for spring to arrive and save them. Father Benedict spent increasing amounts of time in prayer, but Margot noticed that even his faith seemed tested by the severity of their situation. The first week of April brought a cruel twist that tested the village's remaining resolve. Just as some villagers had begun to hope that winter might be loosening its grip, temperatures plummeted again, creating conditions that were more severe than anything they had experienced all season. The sudden cold snap caught several families off guard, leading to frostbite injuries and a renewed consumption of their carefully hoarded fuel supplies. It was as if winter was making one final vengeful assault before releasing its hold on the land. Guillaume's condition had deteriorated significantly during this cold snap. His persistent cough had developed into something more serious, with fever and difficulty breathing that left Margot deeply worried about his survival. At 31 years old, he had always been the family's source of physical strength, but now he spent most of his time lying quietly near the fire, his breathing labored and his face flushed with fever. The combination of months of poor nutrition and the constant stress of cold exposure had finally overwhelmed his body's ability to resist illness. Thomas, their youngest child at 4 years old, had also reached a critical point. His small body had used up most of its reserves during the long months of reduced food and constant cold. He no longer had the energy to walk more than a few steps at a time, and his once bright eyes had become dull and unfocused. Margot knew from her mother's stories about previous famines that children could decline very rapidly once they reached this state, and she watched her youngest son with growing desperation. The community's shared resources were now almost completely exhausted. The combined food stores that had seemed to offer hope just 2 weeks earlier were reduced to a few handfuls of grain and some preserved vegetables that were barely edible. Father Benedict had stopped calculating how long their supplies might last, as the mathematics had become too depressing to contemplate. Instead, he focused on maintaining the group's spiritual strength and organizing the search for any possible additional food sources. Foraging in the deep snow had become a daily necessity. Despite the extreme difficulty and danger involved, small groups of the stronger villagers would venture into the forest, searching for any edible materials they could find. Tree bark, certain roots that might have survived the winter underground, and even pine needles that could be boiled into a thin broth became precious resources. These foraging expeditions were exhausting and often dangerous, as weakened people struggled through deep snow and bitter cold. But they represented the community's only hope for additional food. Marie, despite being only 12 years old, had become one of the most effective foragers. Her smaller size allowed her to move more easily through the snow, and her sharp eyes could spot potential food sources that adults might miss. She had learned to identify which tree barks were edible and how to prepare them to make them more palatable. Her contribution to the community's survival efforts had become so valuable that she was given slightly larger food rations to maintain her strength for these crucial expeditions. The village's livestock situation had become desperate. Most families had already slaughtered their animals for food, leaving only a few chickens and one remaining goat in the entire community. These last animals were being kept alive primarily for the eggs and small amounts of milk they could still provide, though their production had dropped dramatically due to poor nutrition and cold stress. The death of each animal represented not just the loss of food, but also the loss of body heat that had helped warm the cottages where they were sheltered. Widow Catherine's medicinal knowledge had become increasingly important as more villagers fell ill. She had been treating Guillaume's respiratory infection with herbal teas made from her carefully preserved plants, though she privately confessed to Margot that her supplies of effective medicines were running very low. She was also caring for several other villagers who had developed various illnesses related to malnutrition and cold exposure, stretching her knowledge and resources to their limits. The psychological impact of their situation was becoming as dangerous as the physical hardships. Several villagers had developed what Father Benedict recognized as the deep despair that could lead people to simply give up the struggle for survival. The constant cold, the persistent hunger, and the seemingly endless nature of their ordeal had pushed some community members beyond their ability to maintain hope. These individuals required constant encouragement and supervision to ensure they continued eating their meager rations and contributing to the group's survival efforts. But there were also small signs that gave Margot reason for cautious optimism. The days were definitely growing longer, and the quality of sunlight was changing in ways that suggested spring might eventually arrive. On the warmest part of sunny days, she could occasionally hear the sound of water trickling somewhere beneath the snow, indicating that temperatures were at least briefly rising above freezing. These tiny changes offered hope that winter's grip might finally be weakening. The community had also discovered reserves of strength and cooperation that surprised even those who had lived together for years. People who had maintained polite but distant relationships before the crisis had formed deep bonds through shared hardship. The artificial barriers of social class and family rivalry had largely disappeared as everyone focused on the simple goal of keeping each other alive until spring could rescue them. Young Peter, the miller's son, had managed to rig a simple trap that had actually caught a rabbit, providing the community with its first fresh meat in weeks. The small animal was carefully divided among all the villagers, with the broth from cooking it distributed to the weakest members of the group. This success had inspired others to attempt similar trapping efforts, though results remained sporadic and unpredictable. As Margot sat watching Guillaume's labored breathing and Thomas's listless behavior, she wondered if her family had the strength to survive whatever final challenges winter might present. The second week of April brought a change so subtle that at first, Margot thought she might be imagining it. During the warmest part of the afternoon, she noticed a small patch of ground near the south-facing wall of their cottage where the snow had melted completely, revealing dark, muddy earth beneath. This tiny area of exposed ground, no larger than her hand, represented the first sign that winter's iron grip on the land might finally be weakening. The sight of actual earth, after months of seeing nothing but white snow and ice, filled her with an emotion so powerful that she found herself weeping. Guillaume's condition had stabilized somewhat, though he remained very weak. The fever that had threatened his life during the previous week had finally broken, leaving him exhausted but no longer in immediate danger. His breathing was easier, and he had managed to eat small portions of the thin gruel that had become their primary sustenance. At 31 years old, his body was showing remarkable resilience, though Margot could see that the winter had aged him considerably. His face was gaunt, his hair had thinned, and his hands shook with weakness, but he was alive. Thomas, their youngest child, had also begun showing small signs of improvement. The 4-year-old had started taking a few more steps around their small living space, and his eyes occasionally showed flashes of their former brightness. He had even asked for water on his own initiative, the first time in weeks that he had expressed any kind of want or need. These tiny improvements gave Margot hope that her youngest son might survive until proper food became available again. The village's foraging efforts had become more successful as small patches of ground began to emerge from the snow. The foragers had discovered early spring plants that were just beginning to emerge, tender shoots that could be eaten raw or added to their thin soups. These fresh greens provided vitamins that their bodies desperately needed after months of preserved foods. And even small amounts seemed to provide noticeable improvements in energy and health. Marie, at 12 years old, had made a discovery that proved crucial to the community's survival. While exploring an area where the snow had melted around a large boulder, she found a patch of wild onions that had survived the winter underground. These small but flavorful bulbs could be eaten raw or cooked, providing both nutrition and a taste that made their other meager foods more palatable. Her find was shared equally among all the villagers, with each family receiving a small portion that seemed incredibly precious after months of bland, monotonous meals. Father Benedict had begun conducting daily prayer services focused on thanksgiving for these small signs of spring's approach. The community gatherings, held in the church when fuel could be spared to heat it, provided emotional support that was as important as the physical improvements in their situation. The priest's messages emphasized patience and continued cooperation, reminding the villagers that they had survived the worst of winter and needed to maintain their unity just a little longer. The shared resource system that had been implemented during the crisis continued to function, though it was evolving as conditions slowly improved. Families that had been entirely dependent on community support were beginning to contribute more to the group effort as their strength returned. The cooperative work that had developed out of desperation was proving to have benefits beyond simple survival, creating stronger bonds within the village community than had existed before the crisis. Widow Catherine's medicinal work had become increasingly effective as she gained access to early spring plants that could supplement her preserved herbs. She had found young nettle shoots that could be brewed into teas with remarkable healing properties, and willow bark that was effective for treating pain and fever. Her patients, including Guillaume, were showing steady improvement as these fresh medicines became available to supplement her dwindling stores of preserved remedies. The village's remaining livestock were also benefiting from the subtle changes in weather and food availability. The few surviving chickens had begun laying eggs more regularly, providing a crucial source of protein and fat that had been almost entirely absent from their diet during the worst weeks of winter. Even the single remaining goat was producing slightly more milk, though the amounts were still pitifully small compared to normal seasonal production. But perhaps most importantly, the psychological atmosphere in the village was beginning to change. The deep despair that had characterized the worst weeks of winter was gradually being replaced by cautious optimism. People were beginning to make plans for spring planting, discussing repairs that would be needed on their cottages, and even engaging in conversations about topics other than immediate survival. This mental shift was as important as any physical improvement in their circumstances. The foraging expeditions were yielding increasingly diverse results as more ground became accessible. Wild garlic, early mushrooms, and various edible roots were being discovered and carefully harvested. Each new find was treated as a treasure, shared equally among the community, and prepared with care to maximize both its nutritional value and its contribution to morale. Young Peter had managed to improve his rabbit trap design, resulting in the capture of 2 more small animals during the week. These catches, while still modest, represented a significant improvement in the community's protein intake and provided hope that hunting and trapping might become more successful as spring progressed and wildlife became more active. As Margot watched the small patch of exposed earth gradually expand day by day, she began to believe that her family might actually survive their ordeal. But she also knew that they were not yet safe, and that the transition from winter to spring could bring its own challenges and dangers. On April 22nd, as Margot stepped outside her cottage in the early morning light, she witnessed something that took her breath away and changed everything about their situation. The sun, rising over the eastern hills, illuminated a landscape that was transforming before her eyes. Streams of meltwater were running everywhere, creating a symphony of trickling, gurgling sounds that spoke of winter's final retreat. But most remarkably, scattered across the hillsides where the snow had melted, she could see patches of green, actual growing plants pushing up through the dark earth toward the warming sun. The transformation had happened with startling suddenness. Just 3 days earlier, the world had still been predominantly white and frozen. Now, as temperatures had finally climbed consistently above freezing during the day, winter's grip was collapsing rapidly. The sound of dripping water came from every cottage roof, and the paths between buildings were becoming streams of muddy slush that made walking treacherous, but filled everyone's hearts with joy. Guillaume had managed to walk outside unaided for the first time in weeks, his strength slowly returning as their food situation improved, and his body began to recover from the respiratory infection that had nearly killed him. At 31 years old, he was still weak and moved carefully, but the mere fact that he could stand and walk represented a victory that had seemed impossible just days earlier. He spent long minutes simply standing in the weak spring sunlight, his face turned toward the sky like a plant seeking nourishment. The village's foraging efforts had suddenly become remarkably productive. What had been desperate searches for any edible material were now successful expeditions that returned with increasingly substantial amounts of food. Wild leeks, early berries, and various edible roots were becoming available in quantities that allowed the community to begin thinking beyond simple day-to-day survival. For the first time in months, people were eating enough food to feel genuinely satisfied. Marie, their 12-year-old daughter, had made the most significant discovery of all. While exploring a south-facing slope where the snow had melted earliest, she found clear evidence of last year's vegetable garden belonging to a cottage that had been abandoned when its elderly occupants died early in the winter. Buried beneath the snow and hidden all winter, rows of root vegetables had survived in surprisingly good condition. Carrots, parsnips, and turnips that had been left unharvested in the autumn were still edible, providing the community with a windfall of food that seemed almost miraculous after months of near starvation. The psychological impact of these discoveries was as important as their nutritional value. The community that had been focused entirely on survival for so many months suddenly began to engage in planning and hope for the future. Conversations turned to spring planting, cottage repairs, and even social activities that might be possible once life returned to normal. The transformation in mood was remarkable. As people who had been withdrawn and focused only on immediate needs began to interact socially and even laugh occasionally, Father Benedict organized a special service of Thanksgiving that drew every surviving member of the village community. The church, which had been too cold to use regularly during the worst of winter, was now warm enough for extended gatherings. The priest's message focused on the importance of remembering the lessons they had learned during their ordeal and the bonds of cooperation and mutual support that had enabled them to survive when individual efforts might have failed. Thomas, their youngest child at 4 years old, showed the most dramatic improvement of anyone in the family. Children's bodies, when provided with adequate nutrition, could recover from malnutrition with remarkable speed. Within days of having access to better food, his energy levels increased dramatically, his color improved, and his personality began to return to something resembling his normal, cheerful self. Watching her youngest son play with simple toys for the first time in months filled Margot with gratitude that felt almost overwhelming. The village's remaining livestock were also responding dramatically to the improving conditions. The chickens were laying eggs daily now, and the single surviving goat was producing enough milk to provide meaningful nutrition for the weakest community members. Plans were already being made to acquire new animals to replace those that had been lost during the winter, using eggs and milk as trade goods with nearby communities that had fared better during the crisis. But perhaps the most important revelation was about the community itself. The sharing and cooperation that had developed during the worst weeks of winter had created social bonds that were stronger than anything that had existed before the crisis. Neighbors who had been polite but distant had become extended family. The artificial distinctions of wealth and social status that had previously divided the community had largely disappeared, replaced by relationships based on mutual dependence and shared experience. Widow Catherine's role in the community had been permanently elevated by her contribution during the crisis. Her medical knowledge and herbal remedies had literally saved lives, and her calm, competent presence during the worst times had provided emotional stability for everyone. She was now consulted on all community decisions and treated with a respect that reflected her proven value to the group's survival. Young Peter, the miller's son, had also earned a permanent place of respect within the community. His ability to create satisfying meals from minimal ingredients, his successful hunting and trapping efforts, and his consistent positive attitude during the darkest times had marked him as a natural leader. Despite his youth, plans were already being discussed for expanding his role in community food production and distribution. As Margot looked around at her surviving family and their recovering community, she realized that their ordeal had revealed strengths and resources that none of them had known they possessed. The winter that had nearly destroyed them had also transformed them into something stronger and more resilient than they had been before. May arrived with an explosion of life that seemed almost magical after the long months of winter's deathly stillness. The hillsides around the village had transformed into a tapestry of green and brown, with new grass pushing up through the soil and trees, beginning to show the first hints of budding leaves. The air itself felt different, carrying scents of growing things and the rich smell of earth warming in the strengthening sun. For Margot, who had survived her 28th winter but had never experienced one so severe, This spring felt like a resurrection. The village's food situation had improved dramatically with the arrival of warmer weather. Wild foods were becoming abundant, with edible plants appearing in greater variety and quantity each day. Dandelion greens, wild garlic, and early berries provided fresh flavors and essential nutrients that their bodies craved after months of preserved foods. The community's foraging expeditions, which had been desperate survival efforts just weeks earlier, were now pleasant social activities that yielded more food than the group could consume immediately. Guillaume's recovery had been remarkable to witness. At 31 years old, his body had proven resilient enough to bounce back from the respiratory infection and malnutrition that had nearly killed him. He was now able to work for several hours each day, focusing on repairs to their cottage and preparations for spring planting. His cough had completely disappeared, his color had returned to normal, and his hands no longer shook with weakness. The transformation was so complete that it was sometimes hard to remember how close they had come to losing him. The family's cottage required extensive repairs after the harsh winter. The constant heating and cooling cycles had created cracks in the walls that needed to be filled with fresh daub. The roof showed damage from the weight of snow and ice, requiring new thatch in several areas. But these repair tasks, which would have seemed overwhelming during the winter crisis, now felt manageable and even enjoyable. The work represented a return to normal life and hope for the future. Marie, at 12 years old, had emerged from the winter crisis as a remarkably capable and mature young woman. Her contributions to the family and community survival had earned her respect and responsibility that would normally have been reserved for adults. She was now trusted with important tasks like managing the family's seed supplies and planning their vegetable garden. Her experience during the crisis had taught her practical skills and developed character traits that would serve her well throughout her life. The community's cooperative arrangements, which had developed out of desperate necessity during the winter, were evolving into permanent improvements in how the village functioned. Families continued to share resources and labor, even though individual survival was no longer threatened. The garden plots were being planned cooperatively to ensure that different families grew different crops, creating diversity that would benefit everyone through trade and sharing. Thomas, their youngest child, had recovered so completely from his winter illness that he seemed to have more energy than before their ordeal began. At 4 years old, his body had bounced back from malnutrition with the remarkable resilience of childhood. He spent his days exploring the recovering landscape, collecting interesting stones and watching the insects and small animals that were becoming active as the weather warmed. His laughter, absent for so many months, had returned to fill their cottage with joy. The village's livestock situation was gradually improving through trade with other communities. A traveling merchant had arrived with chickens and goats for sale, accepting payment in the form of labor and preserved foods that the community had managed to accumulate. The sound of chickens clucking and goats bleating was returning to the village, bringing with it the promise of eggs, milk, and eventual meat that would help prevent future food crises. Father Benedict had begun holding regular services again, now focused on Thanksgiving and community building rather than desperate prayers for survival. The church had become a center for planning community activities, organizing cooperative work projects, and celebrating the small victories of daily life. The priest's leadership during the crisis had strengthened his relationship with the community and established him as not just a spiritual guide but a practical leader as well. Widow Catherine had decided to formally establish herself as the village's healer and herbalist, a role she had essentially filled during the crisis but had never officially claimed. She was now teaching her knowledge to several younger women, including Marie, ensuring that the community would have medical resources available if future emergencies arose. Her cottage was being expanded to include a proper space for preparing medicines and treating patients. The memory of Henrik, the blacksmith who had died during the worst part of winter, was being honored through plans to establish a permanent memorial and to ensure that his smithing knowledge was preserved. Young Peter was being taught basic metalworking skills by a traveling craftsman, with the goal of eventually providing the village with essential metal tools and repairs that Henrik had previously supplied. As May progressed, the community began to engage in activities that had been impossible during the winter months. Social visits between families resumed, children played games outdoors, and adults found time for crafts and skills that went beyond immediate survival needs. The return of these normal activities felt precious and meaningful in ways that would have been difficult to appreciate before experiencing their near loss. The spring planting was approaching, and with it the opportunity to grow food that would help prevent future winter crises. The community was planning larger gardens, more diverse crops, and better preservation techniques based on what they had learned during their recent ordeal. The knowledge gained through suffering was being transformed into practical improvements that would benefit future generations. But even as life returned to normal patterns, Margot found that she could not entirely forget the lessons of their difficult winter. As June arrived with its warm days and long hours of sunlight, Margot stood in her expanded vegetable garden and reflected on the profound changes that the harsh winter had brought to her family and community. At 28 years old, she had survived what the villagers were already calling the winter of trials, an ordeal that had tested every aspect of their knowledge, strength, and character. The lessons learned during those difficult months were already being woven into the fabric of their daily lives, creating a community that was stronger and more resilient than it had been before. The garden she tended was larger and more diverse than any she had planted before. The winter's food shortages had taught her the importance of variety in preservation and nutrition. So this year's planting included new vegetables and herbs that could provide different sources of vitamins and minerals. She had also learned the value of community cooperation, so her garden was part of a village-wide plan that ensured different families would grow different crops, creating a safety net through diversity. Guillaume, fully recovered at 31 years old, was working with other men in the village to improve their fuel gathering and storage systems. The winter had taught them that individual family efforts were insufficient for truly severe weather, so they were creating community woodpiles and shared storage areas that could serve multiple families during future emergencies. The knowledge of which trees provided the best fuel, how to properly season and store wood, and how to ration fuel effectively had become part of the village's collective wisdom. The preservation techniques that had saved their lives were being refined and expanded based on what they had learned about which methods worked best and which foods provided the most nutrition during long storage periods. Margot was teaching these techniques to younger women in the village, ensuring that the knowledge would be passed on to future generations. The summer's preservation work was being approached with a seriousness and thoroughness that reflected their new understanding of how crucial these skills could become. Marie, now 13 years old and remarkably mature for her age, had become something of a local expert on foraging and wild food identification. Her discoveries during the spring had saved the community, and she was now teaching other children how to identify and gather edible plants that could supplement their diet during normal times and provide emergency food during crises. Her knowledge represented a bridge between traditional survival skills and the practical needs of village life. The community's cooperative systems, born from desperate necessity during the winter, had evolved into permanent improvements in how they shared resources and supported each other. Families now routinely shared tools, labor, and knowledge in ways that made everyone more secure and efficient. The social bonds forged during their shared ordeal had created a sense of extended family that included the entire village. Thomas, at 5 years old, had no conscious memory of how close he had come to death during the winter, but his experience had influenced his development in subtle ways. He was more appreciative of food than most children, more willing to share with others, and more interested in learning practical skills from the adults around him. The crisis had shaped his character even though he was too young to understand what he had endured. Father Benedict had established new traditions within the village that honored their survival and maintained the lessons they had learned. An annual day of remembrance for those who had died during the winter, including Henrik the blacksmith, provided an opportunity to share stories and preserve knowledge. Weekly community gatherings during the winter months would help maintain social bonds and allow for resource sharing before crises developed. Widow Catherine had become the village's most respected citizen, her medical knowledge and calm leadership during the crisis having earned her a permanent position of authority within the community. She was training several apprentices in herbal medicine and establishing gardens, specifically for growing medicinal plants. Her cottage had become a community resource, with space for treating patients and storing medical supplies that could serve everyone during future emergencies. The village's relationship with neighboring communities had also been strengthened by their experience. The knowledge that mutual aid during crises could mean the difference between survival and death had led to formal agreements for sharing resources during emergencies. Trade relationships had been established that would provide access to different types of food and materials that could help prevent future shortages. Young Peter, now 17 years old, had used his experience during the crisis to establish himself as a leader within the village. His success with hunting and trapping, his skill at food preparation, and his positive attitude during difficult times had marked him as someone who could be relied upon during future challenges. He was being groomed to take on greater responsibilities within the community's leadership structure. The memory of their ordeal remained vivid enough to influence daily decisions about food storage, fuel gathering, and community cooperation, but it was no longer a source of trauma or fear. Instead, it had become a source of pride and confidence. They had faced conditions that might have destroyed other communities, and they had not only survived, but had emerged stronger and more united than before. As Margot looked around at her thriving garden, her healthy family, and her resilient community, she understood that the winter of trials had given them something precious beyond mere survival. It had taught them that human beings possessed reserves of strength, ingenuity, and compassion that could overcome almost any challenge when they worked together with knowledge, determination, and hope. The techniques that had sustained them through those dark months, from food preservation to fuel conservation to community cooperation, were now permanent parts of their lives. They had become not just survivors, but masters of the skills necessary to thrive in a harsh and unpredictable world. Their victory over winter had been complete, and the wisdom they had gained would serve them and their children for generations to come. Thank you for joining me on this cozy corner of history. If you enjoyed our time together tonight, I'd love it if you'd subscribe and share these stories with a friend. There are so many more fascinating tales to explore together. But for now, I'll bid you a fond good night. Stay warm, stay safe, and I'll see you next time for another journey into the past. Sweet dreams.